Welcome, everybody. I'm glad you were able to join us for this presentation. As you can see, today's session is a trustee training overview. So I presented this session for several library boards of trustees. So if your library board thinks you would like to have a presentation for library trustee training, just let me know and we'll come and do it for your board. This session is an overview. So there are several other trustee training sessions that MVLS does and that we have done for boards and would be happy to do for your board. Those other sessions are on legal issues for library trustees, financial responsibility for library trustees, planning and development for library boards, and finally, a session on board development, on how to keep your board strong. So all of these issues are things that we're going to talk about a little bit today, but we can't do all of that detail. As we go through today's session, I'll be mentioning the other trustee training sessions that MVLS does. One other thing to show you is the Bible for Library Trustees. So I know you're all probably familiar with this book, Handbook for Library Trustees in New York State. Everything that we cover in this training is in the handbook. Please make use of the handbook. It is in this print version, but also available on the web. As we go through today's training, there are several times in which I'll be showing you pictures of library services being active in the community. And that's because that is probably the most important thing for library trustees to know. This is what you are entrusted with, the library mission. Sometimes it's easy for boards to sort of get lost in the weeds, and it's a good idea to always come back to, we're here to provide library service to the community, and it is the trustee's primary job to enable that mission, to facilitate that mission, to let that mission happen in your community. So as you saw from our initial slide, there are 4 sections to this training. The first one called Be Informed, Engaged, and Involved. And this kind of is an illustration of it isn't uncommon for when people first join a board of trustees for them to have a certain amount of naivete, for them not to really know what it is that a trustee does. I'm sure that, I've been in that position when I joined boards of trustees, and I've experienced that in a variety of ways. It may be true that somebody joins the library board thinking that, oh, I'm going to get to spend more time in the library, and maybe, the collection will begin to reflect my tastes a little more. That's really not what it's all about. Becoming a trustee is sort of like joining a business and becoming a mover and a shaker in the organization that you are a trustee. I've seen several examples, people joining boards thinking that they are going to make a big change in an organization. And again, it's kind of an uncomfortable thing for people when they join a board of trustees of a library or many other organizations, that you rapidly discover that the organization is more complicated and more regulated than you maybe thought it was. So I mentioned that there's a separate session on legal issues. So we're going to jump through some of these legal issues pretty quickly. But the first thing is to understand kind of how libraries fit into the overall landscape. So most people know that public libraries are regulated by the state education department. So we fall under the New York State Education Department. Within the Education Department, there is an office called the Office of Cultural Education, and there's a Deputy Commissioner of Cultural Education. Underneath that Deputy Commissioner, there is the state library structure. And within the state library structure, there is an organization known as DLD. Anybody who has been involved with libraries for any length of time begins to hear that acronym DLD. DLD stands for the Division of Library Development. And they are the people directly responsible for regulating public libraries in New York State. So a lot of the things that we're going to talk about sort of come from them. The Library Trustees Handbook that we looked at before is produced partly by the Division of Library Development. They're kind of the people who are in charge. So as we look at being informed, engaged, and involved, and talking about the role of the State Education Department, there is a second document that is produced by the State Education Department called the Statement on the Governance Role of a Trustee or Board Member, and this includes library trustees. Within this document, it presents 3 duties for library trustees, and sometimes these can be a little bit off-putting or maybe scary for people, but they are really common sense things when you get into it. So the three duties covered in this publication are the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the real tough one, the duty of obedience. So what does this all mean? The duty of care is very much what it sounds like. You have to care. And there's another big word that gets thrown around with that duty of care, and that's the word fiduciary. A lot of people, when they hear that word, they assume that it is talking about financial responsibility, but it's really bigger than that. A fiduciary is somebody who acts on behalf of another. And this kind of gets into what a trustee really is and why that word trust is embedded within the word trustee. When you're a trustee, you are serving as a fiduciary for the community that you serve. So the 7 or 9 or however many board members there are to your library are all people who have taken on the responsibility of library service in the community on behalf of all the other people in the community. So that's what the duty of care means. When you join a board of trustees, you're in a way pledging allegiance to this organization that you are a board member of. It's not uncommon for people to sort of compare it to, say, being elected to an office like a town board or a county legislature, but it's not really like that. When you become a library trustee or a trustee of any similar organization, you are pledging allegiance to that organization, and that's what the duty of care means. That kind of comes into the duty of loyalty too. The duty of loyalty means that you, when you are acting as a trustee, your first loyalty, the thing that you always come back to, is the good of the organization that you're serving. You know, you may have individual views that conflict in some ways with what the library is doing, but it is the good of the library. That loyalty, the duty of loyalty, means mostly loyalty to that library. And that gets into the concept of conflict of interest. So you have a conflict of interest whenever your personal good, in a way, conflicts with the good of the library. It's important for people to disclose those conflicts of interest and always maintain that duty of loyalty to the library. Finally, we have the duty of obedience, the scariest one of all. So what does this mean? Obedience to who? Is really obedience to that concept of collective authority. So here's one way of thinking of that. There's kind of a hard truth that is involved with serving as a library trustee. And that truth is this: a library trustee has individual responsibility concerning the library, but they don't really have individual authority concerning the library. All the authority is collective authority, authority that the board exercises as a whole, not as individuals. So we're going to move on. Because there's a separate presentation just on legal issues, I'm going to go through the legal aspects quickly here. The libraries are controlled by state laws, primarily education law, but there are other aspects of law that also affect libraries. And two that continually come up are open meetings law. So all library boards are subject to open meeting laws. Meetings, library boards are open meetings. That means open to the public and announced to the public. And the second one is library confidentiality. Neither of those are in education law, but they are state laws that affect libraries. And the library confidentiality law is simply that the library cannot reveal who uses the library or how they use the library. So that's the law part. The regulation part is there is the New York Code of Rules and Regulations. The 90 section of those rules and regulations for education are regulations for libraries. There are a couple of those regulations that come into common practice in libraries. The first one is free direct access. That's regulation 90.3. And free direct access simply means that all of our libraries serve people regardless of where your library may be in one particular community. Say that was Cobleskill, but you serve people who aren't from Cobleskill. That's regulation 90.3, free direct access. Anybody who wants to can come into a library, as long as they follow the rules, can come into a library and use that library. That's free direct access, a state regulation. The other regulations that people should be aware of are the minimum standards for libraries, and particularly since those minimum standards are going to be changing effective January 1st next year, 2021. So that's definitely something for you to be aware of. And then there are things that don't rise to the level of regulation, but are still things that the libraries have to be aware of and follow. And those are a lot of the rulings that come down from the Division of Library Development that control things like how do we fill out our state annual reports. All those conventions are important to us. So now I want to talk a little bit about how the Mohawk Valley Library System fits into that and what our role is as the system. We mentioned that we fall under the State Education Department. All libraries fall under the Education Department and the Office of Cultural Education and the Division of Library Development. The systems, the public library systems, are kind of the next level under the Division of Library Development. So a lot of your individual libraries' contact with the state is mediated through the system. That gives the system a little bit of a regulatory role in a way. And the way that works is, for example, if your library wasn't meeting minimum standards, and this has happened a couple of times in the last few years, what happens is the Division of Library Development gives me a call and says, Eric, you need to talk to XYZ library because they're not meeting minimum standards, and your job is to see that they do meet minimum standards. So where we think of as the library system's mission being that we educate, empower, support, enrich libraries, there's also that kind of regulatory aspect that comes to that. The next thing we come to is knowing your critical documents, your charter, your bylaws, policies, and reports. A library charter is your incorporation document. It's the thing that is filed with the Board of Regents at the State Education Department that gives you existence as a recognized organization. And your charter defines several things. Okay, first, it defines the purpose. So a library charter is always going to have the purpose being providing public library service to your community. The second thing is it defines the legal structure of the library. So there are different kinds of library. The most common library in the Mohawk Valley Library System is an association library. An association library is a private, not-for-profit organization that provides a public service, library service for a community. And it's important for people in association libraries to note that that definition has two opposite words in it. That is public and private. You are both public and private at the same time. Private in that your organization is not controlled by a municipality or controlled directly by voters in most cases. Public in that you provide a public service and you are subject to laws that have to do with providing public service, like open meetings law. So the other kinds of libraries are municipal libraries, which are specifically organized and funded by municipalities. And the final kind is district libraries, most common being school district libraries, which serve a defined geographic area, the school district, kind of by direct input from that area. So the trustees are elected directly by the public. The budget is voted on directly by the public. That's what it means to be a district library. So that's the second thing defined in your charter. The third thing defined in the charter is your place. So your official service area. Who are you designed to provide services to? Always defined in charter. And in most of our libraries' cases, it's a school district or it's a town, a county, or various combinations of those things. The final thing defined in the charter is information about your trustees. The number of trustees, which is usually a term in a charter. The most common is 5 to 15 or 5 to 25. A charter will define the number of trustees in that way. The second thing defined about the trustees are the term length. So it's usually 3 or 4 or 5 years. That term length is set, and it is set in the charter. The only way to change it is to change the charter. And finally, charter contains information on how those trustee seats are filled, whether it is elected by the public, appointed by a municipality, or in the case of most association libraries, appointed by the sitting board. So the board selects who will be their successors in a way. So the other critical documents that we need to talk about are your bylaws, policies, and reports. And we'll cover those more as we go along. So there are two other parts of being informed, engaged, and involved. And those are being attentive and aware and being a library champion. So what do we mean about these? That kind of comes back to that duty of care. that as a board member, our allegiance is to the organization. And so as a board member, you need to be well aware of what's happening in your organization. Doesn't mean you have to be at the library every day, that you have to be the top borrower or anything like that, but it means that you need to be well acquainted with the services that the library provides and with how the library interacts with the community. And finally, the part about being a library champion, that means that advocacy part of it. So again, when you join the library board, you are giving your allegiance to this organization, and you need to tell the library's story in the community. Make sure the community is aware of what the library is doing, and also be the two-way street so that you also bring community concerns back to the library through the Board of Trustees. And always remember that your real purpose is to facilitate the library mission. It is to make sure that library services are provided in your community. And that brings us to our next slide. The next section is to focus on the library mission. How do you, as board members and as a board of trustees as a whole, facilitate that mission? So again, we're going to come back to this concept of individual responsibility, but collective authority. So it's an uncomfortable truth about serving on the board that board service is something that only happens when a quorum of the members of the board are gathered in a legally called and legally held meeting. Well, if you think about that, for most of your libraries, that's maybe 20 hours a year, 24 hours a year. If you're really busy doing something, maybe a little bit more than that. But it's a tiny fraction of the time that your library is serving the public. So how can the board possibly accomplish its role of facilitating the mission when the board only exists 24 hours out of a whole year? Well, the way you do that is through all of the things listed on this slide, through mission and plan of service, through your policies, through your role as evaluating services and determining how the community is using services, and finally, the advocacy part that completes that wheel, how you tell the library's story. So libraries are entrusted with the mission of the library. This gets back to that idea of trust and what you are entrusted with when you are a trustee. The thing that you're entrusted with is the mission, or that idea of the services that your organization, the library, provides to the community. There are lots of other things that trustees are responsible for: the building, the real estate, the financial assets, the library collection, the human resources, the staff. All of these things are important things that trustees need to be involved in. But the fact of the matter is those are all things that support the thing that the trustee is really empowered with, and that is the mission and the service to the community. So let's talk a little bit about mission statements and plans of service. And we'll cover this in other areas, and it is covered in more detail in the planning trustee training session that we do. But a mission statement is usually a one sentence or maybe two sentence statement of summarizing how the library serves the community. A plan of service gives structure to that mission statement and sort of explains how those services are provided. So both are important parts of that. There are a couple of ways that MVLS seeks to help libraries with that kind of planning. So we have a thing called the 21st Century Library Initiative, which a few of our libraries are participating in. We encourage everybody to look at that kind of planning as a way to help your library better serve the community. And when we do that, what we're really doing is helping libraries develop mission statements and plans of service. As we move away from mission and plan of service into policies, the policies are the meat of how the trustees are able to accomplish their purpose in the vast majority of the time that the board is not meeting. So the board sets policies to help the staff know how they should be implementing the mission of the library. There's lots of information available on policies. The Handbook for Library Trustees in New York State has lists of policies that libraries should have. And as we go through, we'll cover a couple of those in this session, and they're covered much more in other trustee training sessions. But the policies are something that the board is responsible for enacting, and that the staff then uses those policies to help the library perform its mission. The ones we'll talk about today are financial policies and maybe a little bit on personnel policies, but there are many others to do with the library operation that the board needs to be aware of. Evaluation is a very important part of the library trustees and board of trustees role, because evaluation lets the board know whether or not the mission is being accomplished. You're responsible for that mission. Well, is the mission being accomplished? The only way you know that is by doing evaluation. And that evaluation is a part of the 21st Century Library Initiative and other planning activities that MVLS helps libraries with. It's a lot of talking to the community and finding out what the community thinks about the library and how things are doing. And of course, we talked about advocacy. The trustee's role is to make sure that the mission has a future, and that's where advocacy comes in. So getting back to the concept of collective authority and how the board facilitates the mission without being present most of the time. First, you define that mission, and that's where the mission statement and the plan of service come in. Policies are what actively makes that mission happen in the community. Evaluation helps you know whether or not you accomplished the mission and what you need to change in order to make that mission better accomplished. Planning gives the mission a future. It's the board not just looking at today, but looking at how the library is going to work in the future. And finally, advocacy is taking care of the community engagement part of that mission, making sure the community is aware of what the library is doing and making sure the resources are available that the library needs. Our next slide is an example of advocacy. One of the board's roles may be to participate in community events and be there to let people know this is what the library is doing in our community. This is our smallest library, taking care of that part of the mission. So now we've gotten into our third section, which is the business governance. And that business word is there on purpose. The library is very much a business and it should be operating like a business. So how can you make sure that the business of the board gets done? The basic tool for that is the bylaws. So the bylaws are the board's rules for how the board operates. And as we already discussed, check the Handbook for Library Trustees in New York State. That has information on bylaws. There's even a sample bylaws in there. Of course, we at MVLS are always happy to help libraries update their bylaws. The most important thing about bylaws, though, is that you are aware of them and make sure you're following them. And this is one thing that is going to become more important when the new minimum standards come out. The new minimum standards have a requirement that bylaws get reviewed every 3 years. And this is a very good requirement because when organizations get in trouble, it's usually because they have deviated away from their bylaws in some way or another. So keeping those bylaws active and being aware of them and often updating them is an important part of the library trustee's role. Now we get financial responsibilities. This is something that is covered much more in our financial section, but just a quick review of what library boards need to be working on concerning library finances. And the first one is the budget. Having a budget is one of the minimum standards. Every library has to have a budget that is presented to any local funding authority. So it may be presented to the voters, it may be presented to a town board, but that budget is really the library trustees putting financial resources behind accomplishing the mission. And here's where we talk a little bit about policies. There are several financial policies that every library needs to have, and they are listed here. A purchasing policy, so who is enabled to buy things at the library? Who is enabled to expend the library budget? Usually it's the director, but in larger organizations, it could be someone working under the director who is authorized to make purchases. Claims processing means paying the bills. And it is very important for transparency in any public organization, which all libraries are, to have lots of separation of duties and people looking over one another's shoulders concerning the claims processing process to make sure that the money that is allocated to the library mission is really being spent on the library mission. And finally, a cash receipts policy is the same kind of control over income that comes in. How do you account for the income that comes in? How do you make sure that there isn't income being diverted to places where it shouldn't be diverted? So those are the policy part of financial responsibilities. Financial reporting. At every board meeting, the board should review expenditures and income, and they should review a budget, profit and loss versus actual report that allows the library trustees and the library board as a whole to see where the organization is financially based on the library budget, which is the plan for how the organization is going to operate, financial speaking. And then there's the two areas that look into the future. Library boards are there to make sure that the finances are right today, but also there to make sure that organization has a strong future. And that is where planning, sustainability, and advocacy come into that. Now we've gotten into the relationship that the library board has with the library staff. Is probably the most important thing that a board can foster. And I want to encourage all of you to view a different webinar, not done by me, that is called Boards and Directors, the Critical Partnership. Happy to point anyone to that who is looking for it. So it is a truism that you hear on boards that the most important thing that a board does is hire a director. But it really goes way beyond hiring that director. It is what that relationship between the board and the director is critical to the organization functioning as good as it can. So here's a few key concepts to keep in mind. The first one is the director, the CEO, the chief executive officer, the person who is vitally important. The board, as I keep coming back to, is responsible for facilitating the mission, but the board only exists that 20 to 24 hours a year. So how can the board possibly facilitate the mission? We mentioned policies being one way. The second way is that relationship with the director. The board empowers the director to be the individual who makes sure that the mission is accomplished. Another part of that is making sure that you treat your director as a professional. All of this stuff really goes in both directions. It's a relationship. But think about this. When you hire your director, you hired somebody to run the library, and you hired somebody who we all hope knows a lot more about running libraries than people on the board of trustees do. That's what it means that the director is the professional. The director needs to be involved in all aspects of what the library is doing, and their opinion on lots of issues needs to be carefully considered by the board. Not always followed, but always carefully considered. And that gets into the issue of overlapping responsibility. In some ways, there's too much of the concept of, well, this is the staff's responsibility, say selecting library materials. That's something that is commonly said, that's the staff's responsibility. Developing policies, well, that's the board of trustees' responsibility. The fact of the matter is that both the board and the director share responsibilities for everyone. There are some issues, developing policies that are more in the board's purview than in the director's purview. Others, like selecting library materials, that's more in the director's purview than the board, but there's overlapping responsibilities in all of these. And that only works when you have mutual respect. And the big part of that is at a board meeting, nobody should be surprised. The director should never be surprised by an issue that comes up at a board meeting that's raised by a trustee. A member of the public might give you a surprise. And the same way the other way around. The trustees should never be surprised by something that comes up at a board meeting, suddenly appears in the newspaper. That mutual respect and no surprises is a very important part of keeping that relationship between the board and the director strong. Finally, the board's relationship to other staff. As the CEO, the director is responsible for all of the other staff. When we get into the financial presentation, there are two very small exceptions to that, they being a treasurer, a claims auditor, and an external auditor that report directly to the board. But all ordinary library staff is under the director and should be controlled through the director, not individually by the board of trustees. Now we're moving on to board development. And again, there's a separate section for this, and this is all covered in a lot more detail. But just to briefly talk about, boards have life cycles. And they are all important, but it helps to know where you are. So we have one library right now that is in the forming part of the life cycle, and they are doing all the things like developing bylaws and getting new charters and developing policies because they are forming a new organization, a new school district public library to take over library function from the old municipal organization. And you could say that maybe that library is also in the norming phase of developing policies, developing plans, really paying attention to the details. Dorming might sound like it's negative, but it can also be positive. So a library that is in the middle of a building project is probably storming. And of course, what we all want to be as a board is a board that is performing. But just know that as organizations evolve, it is inevitable that you move through these cycles through the time. And it's unusual for an organization to remain in the performing cycle forever because that just doesn't work that way. Communities change, situations change, and often you have to go back around through the cycle again. I'm not going to go through the board personalities now, just to mention that what you're really looking for is a strategic board, a board that is focused on mission and the future of that mission. Those are the most important things for a board of trustees to concentrate on. And finally, the planning process. I'll just talk a little bit about that. The planning process that MVLS uses when we work with libraries is kind of a three-step process. The first part of it is what I call community dreaming, getting lots of people together to talk about the situation in the community, what the community's goals and aspirations are, and maybe what the library's part of that could possibly be. So once you're done dreaming, the next step is to do what I call gap analysis. And that means to figure out what's the difference between what we want and what we have, and what's keeping us from having what we have. Why are we stuck back here instead of where we want to be? That's gap analysis. And sometimes that can be done through something called successive whys. Keep asking that question. Why can't we have the kind of library we'd like to have? Well, we need a bigger budget. Okay, why don't we have a bigger budget? And to keep drilling in to that, to eventually go to the third step, which is develop that action plan for how to accomplish the community's goals. Final slide is just a review of some of the things that may create a problem on library boards. And here we are back with our old friend, collective authority. When collective authority is not respected, when trustees try to enact individual authority, you run into problems. So for boards to have that duty of loyalty and duty of obedience to the collective authority of the board is a very important part of keeping the board healthy. We've already talked about that tension between what is the role of the staff and the director and what is the role of the board. Mutual respect and recognizing that both boards and directors and staffs have a role to play in nearly everything the library does. But in some instances, a role like policy development is more the purview of the board. But at the same time, you're going to use your staff, your director particularly, to help you know what policies you need to enact and help you know what the library best practice is for that issue as well. So, it isn't unusual many times for a library director to say, well, the board just isn't doing what they're supposed to do with policies. Well, guess what? You, the director, are sharing in that failure because it's your job to empower the board to do their job. And it works the same way in the opposite direction. It is the board's job to empower the director to do their job. And that's really what the delegation and each player concentrating on their job means. So we've come to the end. Thank you, everyone, for participating. My plan during this time when we are not able to go to individual board meetings and provide individualized trustee training is to do additional sessions so that they are available anytime boards need them.